Okay. Good evening, everybody. We're here today with Julian Varas and Marcelyn Go, as part of an activity of the Escuela de Arquitectura y Estudios Urbanos from Universidad Torcuato Di Tella. It's public program, the public program of this semester. Today, we are very pleased to have Marcelyn with us, and she'll be doing her presentation as part of a cycle that's been going on for almost 2 years now. It's called the Instant Theory. And I'll be making a very brief presentation of the cycle, and then I'll pass it on to Julian Varas, who will be presenting Marcelyn. Instant Theory promotes the generation of architectural theory at a high speed and with great precision and attention to nuances. It deploys as brief dazzles and a multiplicity of disjointed and heterogeneous ideas that progressively configure a plane of consistency in which relationships initially unpredictable or unthinkable resonate. Far from theory as a critique distance from materials and from mere association in a state of drift, instantaneous theories take the culture of the immediate as a model and become forces to think about the architecture of the present. Leading architects appeal to architectural images in real time in order to formulate a large number of theories in a very short amount of time. And in the recent past, we've been researching about a modality of instant theory that is loose branching, and we will continue doing so today. In the past, we've already had David Salomon, Christopher Hyde, and Hernandez Alonso as part of this agenda called loose branching, which describes a modality of instantaneous theories whose form unfolds through diffuse architectural relationships that exponentially bifurcate in an increasing escalation of interrelated divergences. The bifurcations are not constituted as interruptions marked by strict threshold, but as logical relaxations that, through digressions and apparent banalities, allow the generation of ideas to advance in concatenation, constituting a critical mass. The rigor of ideas does not reside so much in themselves as in the relationships that they can establish within each other, building by redundancy a theoretical texture capable of directly influencing the materials from which they arise. Okay, so I will pass it on to Julian Varas, who is the director of the Master in History and Theory at Di Tella. And then at the end, we'll have a conversation between Julian and Marcelyn and a Q&A with the audience. Hi, Marcelyn. Hi, Julian.
Hello. Hello, Manuel.
Hi,
hello, Marcelyn. Okay, so good evening, everyone, and thank you for being with us. I am Julian Varas. Probably most people know me, professor at the School of Architecture and Urban Studies, and director of the Master in History and Culture of Architecture in the City. It's with great pleasure that I accepted to introduce Marcelyn Gau to the School of Architecture and to Universidad Torcuato Di Tella. I will read some brief remarks, so thank you in advance for your patience. At a time when frameworks for architecture are volatile and attachments to them usually weak and short-lived, Marcelyn Gau, though clearly sensitive to the environments where she has worked over the course of her career, stands out as someone who has consistently straddled the boundaries between architecture, art, and technology, and exploited their synergies with a rare combination of realism and sophistication. This perception of Marcelyn's work is certainly personal, as it has been influenced by the experience of working close to her while teaching at the ETH Zurich many years ago. At that time, Marcelyn had already been around many places and could speak with intimate knowledge about architecture and art, not only in the United States and Europe, but also in many places elsewhere and south of the equator. She had traveled in Africa, studied in London, studied and worked in New York, given lectures with supporting DJ acts at the Architectural Association, and performed less well-known activities such as excursions into the Berlin scene and apprenticeship with virtuoso architect Zvi Hecker. Then came a bunch of fruitful years under the mentorship of Greg Lee at the ETH, and after that, her PhD thesis on the work of the group of artists called EAT, Experiments in Art and Technology, under the direction of rising star art historian Philippe Ursprung, and then her landing in the west coast of the United States, from where she has been operating for the last 15 years, approximately. During much of this cultural roller coaster, Marcelyn maintained her association with Servo, a speculative design practice which she founded and shared for several years, with her partners Chris Perry, David Erdman, and Ulrika Carlson, and which since the late 2000s has transformed into a two-pole association led by Marcelyn and Ulrika, with headquarters in Los Angeles and Stockholm. Throughout the experience of Servo, the members of the practice resided in different cities and countries, from Sweden through Switzerland to various cities in east and west coast of the United States. Servo emerged at a moment of great optimism about technology and was made possible by the ample diffusion of digitalization and internet access during the 1990s. It belongs to a lineage of what used to be called, or maybe still called, network practices, which for many people educated around those years appeared to be the most attractive, if not the only model of architectural association and production. Over the course of these 20-odd years, the work of Servo never ceased to evolve and redefine itself in relationship to the technological and cultural context in which it was produced. The notion of the responsive environment has been present in the projects of Servo since the early days. However, recent years have seen a more explicit absorption, and I apologize for all of the interpretation that I'm putting out here, but I can be corrected later if this is wrong. However, recent years have seen a more explicit absorption of ecological agendas. Likewise, and this might be part of perhaps our conversation later on, some of the cultural changes that have impacted global culture, and that of the United States in particular during the last decade, specifically the increased sensitivity for ethnic, racial, and gender differences, have also found resonance in the work, although not in a representational or overly confrontational way. Overall, and despite the evolutionary adaptations it has undergone, the work of Servo has remained committed to the idea that architecture's main function is to organize experiences of reality in which things that are supposed to be familiar are suddenly recast in a perspective that is unusual, confusing, illuminating, or in any case, critical of the conventions of lifestyle, habitation, and goal-oriented thinking. Inevitably, the work of Servo has always involved the injection of a strong dose of playfulness. That might be in the form of intelligent environments in which the subject receives mysterious feedback signals from the actions performed in space, which in turn influence the actions to follow, opening up a loop of uncertain outcome. Or it might be reflected in the actions performed by the designer on raw matter, whereby bodies are stained, sprinkled, striated, twisted, pinched, perforated, aggregated, or otherwise manipulated. It is hard to find an explanation for these moves if it's not one that involves challenging our notion of what a given type of object might be. So with that, I hope I have conveyed the allure of the work of Servo to those who might not know it or be familiar with it. And so with that, I leave you with Marcelyn, and I welcome Marcelyn to the school and pass it over to you, Marcelyn.
Thank you, Julian. I really, that was such a very, very warm introduction, and with many details. I think you were quite correct on them. And I would also like to thank Julian Varas and Manuel Mensa both for this opportunity to join you at the school, and I look forward to our conversation afterwards. So I think with that, I will share my screen. And Okay. I put the timer. So I was very much enjoyed the invitation to this this concept of instant theory and the provocation of what that might mean to kind of rapidly construct theories, and as Manuel said in the introduction, the unpredictable relationships that occur between different things, and what was referred to as the theoretical texture. So almost like a tapestry or a fabric of things. And so I entitled this iteration of instant theory, What Gathers? Because instantly what came to my mind was to gather several things. Some of them come from our own work in Servo, Los Angeles, and Stockholm. And some come from other practices, from art practices or other projects. And some come from writers and theorists. And so as part of the 24 images, I begin here. And this image is showing the word disorientate. And there's a quote from a wonderful book by Sarah Ahmed. The title of the book is Queer Phenomenology, Orientations, Objects, Others. And in this book, Sarah Ahmed is revisiting the conventional phenomenological discourse, and not coming from the perspective of architecture or purely from philosophy, but really coming from the perspective of queer theory and looking at how an understanding of this might change the way that we think about phenomenology and the way that we apply it maybe to our practices in different fields. And so I just wanted to read this. It says, "It is for this reason that disorientation can move around. It involves not only bodies becoming objects, but also the disorientation in how objects are gathered to create a ground, or to clear a space on the ground, the field. Disorientation occurs when we fail to sink into the ground, which means that the ground itself is disturbed, which also disturbs what gathers on the ground." And so this idea of ground, which is a fundamental thing in architecture, we often talk about how the building meets a ground, what is the ground of theory. So these grounds are here becoming kind of called into question, and the proposition that I understand Sarah Ahmed to be making is that grounds can be comprised when we gather things, or when people gather, they create a ground. And so the ground is not a static thing, but it's something that is subject to change and transformation. And so this next slide, number 2A and 2B, is an image from an installation that Servo Los Angeles Stockholm that we did at SCI-Arc, the Southern California Institute of Architecture in Los Angeles. And this was in 2013. And here we were really looking at the idea of artifacts. And so I wanted to just read a definition of the word artifact that comes from the Oxford English Dictionary. So the definition says, 1, an object made or modified by human workmanship, as opposed to one formed by natural processes. And 2, in the context of science, the artifact is a spurious result, effect, or finding in a scientific experiment or investigation, especially one created by the experimental technique or procedure itself, and also taken collectively as a mass noun, such effects together. So these definitions of the word artifact, I think, bring together a few points that we might make uncertain if we really consider them closely. So one issue is to consider artifacts that do not present this difference between human workmanship and what's called natural processes. So something I think that we have been very invested in is considering that term, the natural versus the human, and the idea that maybe we are in some ways very entangled, that it's not so easy to completely separate those things. And we could also destabilize these definitions of the word artifact by thinking about procedures that kind of create, they bring something else to the production of, in this instance, of a form. So the process of casting, one could say that artifacts come into the final outcome. So we see here these glass-blown lamps and a series of tiles which are placed on the ground that are coming from part of a design for a water flow on a roof landscape. And here we situated them in the space of the gallery. And you can also see in this second image of that installation that on the far wall of the gallery, there's a drawing of geometry, of the kind of abstract form that was used to create the molds for casting these tiles. And the same geometry, different parts of it, were used to create plaster molds into which glass was blown to form these lamps. But what we really embraced was the fact that each artifact in the space is unique, because the moment that you allow material to be cast in this way or the glass to be blown into the mold, there is some degree of uncertainty. And so the geometry is kind of behind all of these, but none of them are the same. And we were sort of fascinated then to present the geometry as part of that exhibition and say, this is just one instance of how we might think about form. And slide number 3 is a definition of the word accumulate. So I was looking at Michel Foucault's wonderful introduction to The Order of Things, an archaeology of the human sciences. And this is a quote taken from that introduction that I think relates to this idea of gathering things to form a ground. There is a worse kind of disorder than that of the incongruous, the linking together of things that are inappropriate. I mean, the disorder in which fragments of a large number of possible orders glitter separately in the dimension without law or geometry of the heteroclite. And that word should be taken in its most literal etymological sense. In such a state, things are laid, placed, arranged in sites so very different from one another that it is impossible to find a place of residence for them, to define a common locus beneath them all. And I think in this wonderful introduction, really Foucault is kind of considering how it is that we communicate, how it is that we construct language, how do we construct science, how do we think about classifying things, ordering things. Why is it that we agree that one word means the same thing in different languages, that we can translate the word for chair in English into the word for chair in Spanish, and that we would both assign that word to objects that we could sit in? And so this idea of how we construct those categories, I think, is something very important to our discipline of architecture, and how we think about defining things like ground, like building, like the natural, like the human-made, that these are all things that are kind of up for question. What is the border between them or the threshold between them? And I think that's why this passage from Michel Foucault also resonates quite well with the work of Sarah Ahmed. And to kind of exemplify this idea of accumulation, for slide number 4, I chose this work by Tony Capellan. It's called Mar Invadido from 2015. And Tony Capellan was collecting all of these objects from beaches and coastlines that had washed ashore. And so the work itself has many layers. On the one hand, it speaks to this accumulation of waste, of trash, of human-made plastics that have been discarded and have ended up washing up and are part of the ocean. And as we know, the garbage patches that are these huge gyres of small microplastics particles that come off of these kinds of objects are part of our environment. They're not as visible. We can use sensors to understand and measure those garbage patches, but this is quite a literal visual instantiation of that. So it speaks at once to our actions on the planet and the fact that these things do not go away. So much like Timothy Morton would speak of hyperobjects, I think this is kind of exemplifying that quality of the hyperobject, something that outlasts the human lifespan and is kind of a mark of the effects of our presence. It also, at the same time, this image I always use in conjunction to think about the passage from Michel Foucault's Introduction to the Order of Things, the idea of ordering and how any one of us, if asked to organize this group of objects, could do it in a very different way. One person might organize them according to their size. One might organize them according to their kind of formal qualities. Is it a slender bottle? Is it a round basket? They might group the objects differently. In this case, there seems to be a grouping based on the saturation of color. So it goes to show how in some way arbitrary those acts of classification are, but they're also quite important because they determine how we move through the world and how we engage in the world. So slide number 5, this is a drawing detail you may recognize from the previous images of the installation of this project Aquiotrope. And so the set of images here that I'm presenting, and also the set of words and definitions, moves away from a kind of legibility that would enable us to name exactly what we are looking at as a set of identifiable objects, in favor of an idea of resolving things to understand them in different ways. So this idea of resolution, which I think is very much part of our contemporary image culture when we consider the digitized image, and much has been written about this, the difference between the digitized image and the photograph. John May, for instance, has written a text called Everything is Already an Image, where he speaks about the difference between an image comprised of data that resembles something in the world versus a photograph, which is actually, the light, the impression of light. It's a chemical process. And so in this case, the drawing, the sort of image of this drawing that was actually a digital drawing that was then using vinyl tape, was inscribed on a wall surface and then again photographed. So the geometry, much like in the exhibition itself, went through an act of translation. And so now we're looking at an image comprised of pixels that resembles a drawing. And so even the act of drawing with the tools we work with today in terms of the digital medium is kind of creating a shift in how we might use that word, the difference between its use in a more analog way and the current way we use it digitally. So I thought, again, this idea of the unpredictable relationship. So here, the line is used as a kind of degree of precision, showing also the different thicknesses in the line and how that line might live in another sense through a series of cast objects, and how that line might become a tool for making something. So the difference between drawing as representation and then drawing literally as something. This is an object. This is by Monika Sosnowska, an artist. It's called Facade from 2016. It's shown here, installed in the Hauser and Wirth Gallery in Los Angeles. And the fascinating thing about Monika Sosnowska's work is that it raises the question of whether this is kind of a ruin that has been kind of collected from a site where a building is being demolished. And at first glance, one, upon encountering her work, thinks that these are things that have been destroyed. A building got demolished, and this kind of structural frame is sort of found in the junkyard and brought into the gallery. But when you get closer to the object, you realize that it's newly fabricated. So it's something that has been made specifically for this purpose. And her project is actually about also working together with fabricators in Warsaw, Poland, where the kind of industry has suffered economically. And so as an artist, she is sort of engaging with these industries and saying, kind of involving them in the fabrication process of her work, and then creating these kind of fictional destroyed pieces of buildings that call into question, why would this building have been destroyed? Where was it? It resonates, it looks slightly, it has a slight resonance with a kind of Mies van der Rohe sort of structural system, maybe. It also resonates with some of the buildings in Warsaw that were destroyed after, in the 1960s and 70s. And so this piece is also a kind of unstable, does it have a real history or is it a kind of fiction? And returning to the drawing in number 7, the detail, so if we look back to the drawing and read it in a different way, the detail allowed us to scrutinize the lines, but the larger drawing, we start to see other figures and objects that could be extracted from this set of lines. And so the question is how we use lines, and it's something that Sarah Ahmed in her book, Queer Phenomenology, describes a passage where someone is reading a text and she says, if you're looking at the lines on the page and you're not even seeing the words, but you're really literally seeing the letters themselves as lines, you cease reading and you understand them as something else. And this is referring back to Edmund Husserl and from his ideas, the text where he sort of speaks about this kind of bracketing out of what was called the natural attitude, so that you could see things in a different way. So the moment you stop reading and you start looking at the text, you see it very differently. And I was thinking how that could be applied to drawings, to architectural drawings that are used to fabricate things. And so the lines again operate, this set of lines becomes activated in a project that we designed for a biotic roofscape for this kind of lecture hall at the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm. So it's a project for looking at how the roof could be activated through curvature to kind of contain different forms of vegetation. But here I just wanted to highlight again the use of a similar geometry with a different set of materials, a different idea about tectonics and wood cladding and ceramic tiles on the roof. This was also related to where the kind of ceramic and concrete tiles in the exhibition derived from. And then here, returning again to this introduction by Michel Foucault from The Order of Things, and a wonderful idea of the tableau, the table. Foucault speaks about the table where things are brought together, where thought is established. And this was introduced to me early in my education by Professor Donald Bates at the Architectural Association, who was my professor. And we read this text and talked a lot about the kind of strange absurdity that if one looks at the list, and this is translated from Jorge Luis Borges, from the analytical language of John Wilkins, which is a short text by Borges. And so I'm looking at it in English. Of course, in Spanish, it would probably also have different nuances. But the idea that there is a fictional Chinese encyclopedia that enumerates all of the animals that are in the emperor's kingdom, and they are listed as being like belonging to the emperor, embalmed, tame, suckling pigs, sirens, fabulous, stray dogs, included in the present classification, frenzied, innumerable, drawn with a very fine camel hair brush, etc., having just broken the water pitcher, that from a long way off look like flies. And so the funny part here is that this list could contain everything that might be in that fictional kingdom, and that if you start to look at the words, not only do some of them maybe contain others in their own category, like the etc. could be open to any of these categories. But then what Michel Foucault points out is even the structure of language. Some of them are adjectives, some are nouns, some are verbs, some are adverbs. So they don't even really hold together as a kind of clear structure. So they create this kind of heterotopia that he is speaking about. Whoops. And so that idea of a table, like how we might create knowledge and organize things we think we know about the world, which are constantly changing as we also invent new instruments for seeing the world, we discover more, we understand the position of the human vis-a-vis the so-called natural in very different ways. So for slide number 10, this is a project by actually another one of my teachers at the Architectural Association at the time, Raoul Bunschoten. This was from a project called The Skin of the Earth, a dissolution in 15 parts from 1991. And I think what's striking here is the idea that this project was designed for an exhibition at the House of Architects in Moscow, in Russia. And at the time, the exhibition was commenting on the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and each of the objects was sort of representing a different part of that union. And the idea of them sort of coming apart and then taking the idea of the house and saying, imagining each of those kind of pieces of the Soviet Union being one of the pieces of furniture in this room, and how each piece of furniture has its own orientation, and none of them are kind of really convening with the others. Like each one has a separate orientation, even though they're kind of coexisting within this space. So I was very struck by that kind of translation into thinking about the political space also as a domestic space in the scale of this installation. And then I wanted to also turn to this term, oblique. These are all terms that kind of percolate out of looking at this book by Sarah Ahmed and some of the words that come up in her writing, and the way that a kind of oblique attitude toward the ground might start to produce a different kind of social relations. It might actually make our understanding of the world transform somewhat. And so looking back into the history in architecture and thinking about Claude Parent and Paul Virilio and their proposition of the fonction oblique. And this is an image from the French Pavilion at the 1970 Venice Biennale, and just showing how that kind of oblique surface gets instantiated in the space. So I paired that, again, this idea of the bringing these disparate things together and gathering things. I thought that idea of the oblique, again, with Monika Sosnowska, another one of her works called Untitled from 2012, that to me, what was striking here is that the stairway that kind of goes nowhere, because the idea of the stair, the treads of the stair as something that would support the body, the human body, to move up the stair, and would kind of give us circulation in an architectural space, is suddenly transformed into something that we would have to orient ourselves differently to, and we would not be able to use in the same way. So I think these two projects or propositions about the work of the oblique and what the oblique can do are quite related to one another. And, also this touches on the idea of furnishing, which is something Monika Sosnowska also speaks of, which is the difference between furniture as something that is static and inert, and the act of furnishing, which is when you bring things into a space and you place them in a space, and the things maybe move around and you move around. And so the idea of furnishing as kind of the production of space, I think becomes sort of fascinating when you look at these domestic scale objects in this project and then also in this project. So the next term for slide 13 is, I'm just going to check the time to make sure okay, is grounds, background, and foreground. So again, from Sarah Ahmed, we have a quote: "A queer furnishing might be about making what is in the background, what is behind us, more available as things to do things with. As soon as we notice the background, then objects come to life, which already makes things rather queer." And so I think that this concept of background is also used in several different senses, that the background could be like the background in a painting. It could be something where the figure might be in the foreground and the background might be understood as the environment that allows that figure to be kind of offset. So it could be a spatial background. The background, Sarah Ahmed also points out, could be a temporal background, as when you learn about the background of a story or someone's background. Where did you come from? Where have you lived? That's your background. So the background is also related to these histories of objects, histories of people, how we arrive in the world at different points, that background is something that comes with us. And the moment we start to look at that, instead of just overlooking it, it allows us maybe to do different things. And I'll elaborate on that in a moment. So this image number 14 is from an exhibition that I designed, co-designed, and co-curated with Herwig Baumgartner from B+U Architects and Gunther Vogt and his office, Vogt Landschaftsarchitekten, they're from Zurich, Switzerland. And the exhibition is called Environmental. This was installed in the SciArt Gallery in 2018. Herwig and I were asked by the director of the school, Hernan Diaz Alonso, who I believe has also spoken as part of this series, to curate an exhibition on something related to the environment. So we chose this title, Environmental, as the AL being, again, shifting between a description, things that are environmental, but we're also producing a new environment inside of the gallery. And so part of the speculation here, because the school is situated adjacent to the Los Angeles River, which is a river that is a very strange river that was a floodplain and was then subsequently, because of the flooding and the desire for the city of Los Angeles to construct and buildings closer to the river and to kind of control the river was turned into a concrete channel. And that is sort of the river that we have today. And there's a lot of discussion about what would happen if the concrete channel was removed. And so this is a fiction imagining that the concrete gets jackhammered and destroyed and removed, so the river can again become a floodplain, and that the water, instead of the polluted water being rushed to the ocean, which is really not good, that the groundwater is kind of purified by re-entering the soil and getting cleansed through those processes and not being flushed directly to the ocean. And so this fictional environment was an inclined surface where everything in the exhibition is recycled. So these big basins are actually caps from water cisterns that are no longer used and have been discarded, and we sort of retrieved from a recycling center. So they're big steel caps, and we filled them with water and then projected the work of various participants in the exhibition, like Isas Kinchinchilla, And Carme Pinos, Wolf Prix was also one of the invited participants. Their work was projected into these basins, and then some of the other basins also contained vegetation from the Owens Valley. So the one you see in the background was Gunter Voigt's office traveled out to the Owens Valley, which is an area where Los Angeles sources much of its water, and that area is now arid. And before 1919, when the aqueduct was built from the Owens Valley to Los Angeles, it was a very agricultural area and had a richer soil. Now it is like a dust bowl condition because the water has been diverted to Los Angeles. And they're working currently, the LA Department of Water and Power is working on remediating that situation. But in order to kind of create awareness of that remote ecology that's tied to our own in Los Angeles, Voigt's office decided to bring some of the vegetation to the gallery and kind of maintain it in this exhibition. And so the 15th image is an image from a text by Meredith Miller. This is a plastyglomerate sample, and it was illustrating a text, Views from the Plastosphere, a preface to post-rock architecture. And this, I think, is fascinating as well in the context of what we just looked at. And again, these sort of loose affiliations that kind of occur when one gathers things. The concrete detritus here being also built matter from the built environment that has been destroyed. Literally, this was again recycled material from construction demolition sites that we borrowed to use for the exhibition. And then the difference between that, which makes you think of like what happens to the things we build, what are their life cycles, and where do they go after they disappear? Here we have a plastyglomerate, and this is almost like a combination between these rocks that we're seeing here and the earlier image from Tony Capelan's work with the plastic bottles. And Meredith Miller, what she points out here that's striking is this is very different when we talk about climate change and its effects. There are different ways we might make that apparent. And one way might be through the presentation of facts and data and showing tables with rising water temperatures, things of that nature. Another way might be to show images of the impacts, images of the floods, of the hurricanes, of the mudslides, of the forest fires, all of these things that we could, sort of illustrate the effects of climate change. But then she says there's this other thing, which is material evidence. So this also washes up on many coastlines around the world, these kinds of things where the plastic is actually now part of the sort of mineral world. And so the provocation that Meredith Miller argues is that these things create a different kind of awareness of climate change and also draw our attention in another way. So I think this is also an instance of what happens when we look at the so-called background. We see different things and we understand different things about the environment. And slide number 16, which is an older work from another artist, from Via Selmans. It's called To Fix the Image in Memory, 1 through 12. And this is a detail from that work. That was an ongoing work from 1977 to 1982, where Via Selmans was collecting these stones from various locations, some of them from deserts in the southwest of the US, and then casting a replica in bronze and meticulously painting and copying all the features of these stones. And so what's fascinating here is that the copy creates a doubt about the authenticity, and it also challenges the conventional role of the artist. Like if the artist was historically, if we go back to kind of thinking about art in Greek times, for instance, that the job of the artist was to replicate nature faithfully. And so in this question, it's sort of like you can no longer tell what's the original what makes the original is what the copy of it might lack, but the copy also brings qualities, again, returning to this definition of artifact that I started with. There are new qualities that by painting this and casting it in bronze, it has a different weight when you pick it up. And so it resembles the stone, but it's also bringing new qualities into the world. And so this question about sort of which one came first is sort of brought on by seeing these objects together. Oops. And this is a close-up of one of those where the attention to detail is so meticulous that it's really difficult to kind of ascertain which one is a replication. And I think this also comments, and I'm not sure that Via Selmans would be thinking about this if she was, but if we think about Viktor Shklovsky's discussion of estrangement from the 1920s, and the idea, the example he uses is making the stone stony again, so that when you like really scrutinize the stone and start to see its qualities and understand it in a very different way, I think it's funny that she was actually using stones. And I don't know if she was thinking about Viktor Shklovsky and estrangement, but to me, it really brought that issue to the fore. And so image number 17A, this is Servo Los Angeles, Stockholm, again, one of our other projects called Semblances from 2015. This was a project that we did for the Los Angeles Municipal Art Gallery as part of an artist fellowship that we had. And here we speculate again, moving from stone to stone, we now see several different stones that are being gathered in this ground. We speculated on the relationship between an image and an object. And so one could think of the image on the wall as being either a photograph of the object that's on the pedestal, or it could be either a rendering, it might be a digital rendering of that object. In actual fact, what it was a photograph of another stone that we found in a landscape and photographed, and then we treated by adding a lot of resolution and making the image very large. So it was, a sort of larger piece that, I guess 30 inches, I'm thinking in centimeters, I'm not sure in centimeters, that the image then starts to take on these other artifacts, that the moment you digitally sample something up and you start to change its contrast, new artifacts come into the space, which have to do with the shadows, the way the light is reflected from the object. They become parts of the image. And then that image was used almost like a drawing might be used, like in the first installation I was talking about, where the lines of the drawing are used to create the molds for fabricating the objects. Here, it was a very automated process where we used a kind of what's called an alpha channel by making the image just purely black and white pixels, and then using them to produce these masses digitally, 3D models, and then 3D printing those. So these are kind of completely sort of digital stones, but their origin is the photograph of an actual stone. And so that image is sort of the template by which those objects are made. So it has nothing to do with being an image of the 3D model. It was actually used to generate the 3D model. So what we were thinking about is like repositioning the role of the image, where it's no longer about representation, but it's about the production of a new form or a new mass. And so image number 18, I'm just checking the time. Okay, is also a close-up of that. And you can see here where maybe the properties of one thing slide off and become part of another. So the question of the identity of what was originally a rock and what is a kind of synthetic rock, and then if we look at it on this scale, it could become an architectural massing. It could later have a life on the scale of a building even. So that the idea of how these artifacts might shift and slip in scale, and that this could become something that also sits on the ground in a particular way and has a particular posture relative to that ground. And then image 19 is a work called Middleburg by the photographer Philippe du Jardin. This is from 2012. And what's striking here, I think also in the discussion of this idea of background, is that we might assume at first glance we're looking at just a very familiar photograph of a small village, maybe somewhere in Europe. And as we start to really look longer at the photograph, we realize that there are some odd things, that there are no windows that are actually kind of shown as windows. All the windows are infilled with this kind of brick material. All the roof tiles are almost identical, that something has been done, the image has been altered to produce, again, this sense of something being made strange, and this sense of what should be in the background suddenly jumps to the foreground. Whoops. And then this piece, number 20, again, the artist Via Selmans, Desert from 1975. I think what is amazing here is that this image started to make me think about the discussion Sarah Ahmed was having about looking at lines, at words and seeing lines and not actually reading the words, because the process Via Selmans used was to go out into the desert, photograph these grounds, and then to bring the photograph into her studio and meticulously using graphite, using like pencil and lead, to draw what she's seeing. And so this is actually a drawing. And when you see them one-to-one, you can see all the small like hatches and lines that create this illusion of something that has occurred. And so one could say, if we look at this, maybe we imagine a process of erosion. We think, the way in which the desert floor looks this way is the wind and water erosion. But it's a complete fiction. It's been drawn into existence. And one could think here of the way that Bruno Latour talks about in his text, visualization and cognition, drawing things together, that the way in which we create realities has to do with being able to draw them, or draw a map, or draw a diagram, to create some kind of drawing to make that present in the world. And I think that's what Via Selmans' work is doing here. And again, it would be something we might overlook. We might walk over this ground, but the moment it's sort of drawn at a very large scale and placed on a wall, we become aware of this ground in a very different way, and it really comes to the foreground. And so it raises the question, again, of the artifact, and are we looking at something that is the semblance of a natural process like erosion, or the semblance of human workmanship? And so I think that distinction between the human workmanship and the natural process gets really conflated in a work like this. And this image is an image, again, of words. Sorry, my timer was about to go off. The word site, the mute ground upon which it is possible for entities to be juxtaposed. And so that was kind of, again, coming from this Michel Foucault text from The Order of Things, something that we started to think about in terms of what is the site, what is this mute ground, and how does it kind of receive objects? How do we understand it? So in much the same way that in the exhibition Semblances, looking at the relationship between the digital image of a stone and then a new sort of stone or rock that's produced from it, this sort of series of images are texture maps that are created when a ground in the landscape is photographed using a process of photogrammetry, and the photogrammetry is used to reconstruct the ground. And when you process that digitally, there's a sort of a side artifact. This is the artifact that accompanies your image file the 3D point cloud that you get and the mesh that you get from it, this is kind of a map of how these pieces, these kind of fragments, need to rewrap that image to make it back into a three-dimensional object. So here you can see an overlay on the plane is this texture map, which is something that for the human eye doesn't really make sense, but computationally it makes complete sense. So when that gets rewrapped, you have this piece of ground that you see above, which was the original thing that was actually photographed. And the here again, we see there's a three-dimensional mesh that is like this bush that was photographed. So we became very interested in using photogrammetry to capture things that are normally very elusive. It's not very good at capturing things like trees and bushes because there are a lot of little pieces and branches, and photogrammetry is very good with surfaces. So in this work, we were exploring how these kind of new understanding of ground could be composed by working with these digital artifacts. So I think in closing, I would just say that the sort of combination of digital and physical ways of working produces a sense maybe of disorientation, as it creates a wonder as to whether we're looking at pixels or point clouds, objects or images, and this kind of slippage between the identity of those things and the way that these new grounds can be created computationally, I think is definitely something that we are currently working on. And I think with that, the last thing I would say is that a process of resolving things may enable us to understand them in other ways, producing identities that challenge the definition of the natural as we make our way through this unstable ground. Thank you.
Thanks, Marcelyn. Thank you very much for your very compelling presentation. Yeah, I have gathered, speaking of what gathers, but I have gathered a lot of notes here. Maybe I would like to say, maybe the first thing I would like to say about the presentation is that it definitely feels like a collection of tools in a way, like a toolbox, like the entire thing is a toolbox, right? That you have somehow collected and as a kind of sedimentation of I guess many years and contexts of work, and then somehow they all come together in this Foucauldian perhaps way, you know, where in a way everything is possible somehow, at least in theory everything is possible and everything can be brought together as long as it yields something, right? Some possibilities. So I see it in perhaps that light, and I think it's very inspiring in that way. But perhaps going more specifically into some of the ideas, I mean, I have a lot of issues to bring up, but maybe I would start with one of the questions that you discussed most, is the idea of the background and how you bring the background somehow through certain operations, you bring it to the foreground. And that reminds me a lot of, I guess, the whole discussion that begins with Benjamin, and you know, saying that you know that architecture operates in the background, and so it's more powerful because of that, because you're not conscious of what it's doing to you, so then you let it do, right? You let it conduct, you know, its work, and today I was, you know, coincidentally looking at this this brief interview with Jeffrey Kipnis, who was saying, architecture should be like the musical score of a film, so that you're paying attention to the film, you're paying attention to the script, what's happening, but the music is telling you how you should feel, how you should react, how it's leading you through the emotional setup. So for me, then a question is, I guess not for me, but I guess a question that comes up based on that is, does it really work the same when you bring the background to the foreground, when you foreground those issues? How does it, maybe you can talk about that in relationship with any specific image or project that you showed. What happens? Because obviously it doesn't operate in the same way, right?
Yeah, I think that the Walter Benjamin reference about, like, I've often thought that relates as well to the fact that architecture has a program or a function, the idea that if we're using, we're entering a building to do something there. And for maybe someone who's not an architect, maybe as an architect, we might look differently than someone who's not, but the fact that you're actually doing something in the space, and you're, as you point out, I think, experiencing something, and maybe the power is that you don't even realize what that's contributing to your experience. I think this idea of shifting that background and foreground is to look at things that are kind of attached to, like, how did that architecture get there? And this is something I was really struck by in reading Sarah Ahmed's book, because the opening chapter of her book talks about Edmund Husserl and talks about this writer, this great philosopher sitting at the table. And he even writes in the ideas about, here I am at my writing table and I'm looking at the table. She really talks about the table a lot. But then she sort of turns the camera from behind and says, what if we look at the whole scene? Like, what has allowed this person to, have the time to write, to construct thought, to construct theory? What sort of opportunities and privileges? And so it kind of extends out. And I think for architecture, it can be interesting to think about, that's what we were trying to do. I guess I would use the exhibition, the environmental exhibition, that saying the moment you're walking across this rocky ground, and it was impossible not to, you really had to look down because it was very unsettling for exhibition visitors. You had to kind of look at your feet and look at the thing you're walking on. And we were hoping that people would start to ask questions like, where did this stuff come from? And we don't even know exactly. I mean, what was interesting is that just a few months before, a bridge near the school at the 6th Street Bridge had been demolished. They're building a new bridge by Michael Maltzin, which is currently under construction. But there was a lot of stuff that looked just like that. And for all we know, it might have been pieces of that bridge. And so it raised the question, like, where does all this stuff go? And, when we think about adaptive reuse today and how we might intelligently start to, rather than just continuing to put new things into the world, it's like, okay, as architects, can we also think about how we treat the things that are already there? And maybe new things come, but maybe somehow in combination with the existing. So I think that's a big discussion in really everywhere, this idea of what happens to the built environment. So that idea, that's where we were also looking at creating some kind of attention to that.
Yes, I thought also of that project in particular, the exhibition with Günther Vogt and I don't remember the third participant, but yeah, I thought about that project too, because it seemed perhaps the most clear in that sense. But you also talked about at the beginning of the presentation, some of the first images, you talked about bringing up unpredictable relations, and bringing up some kind of unforeseen effects. And I think that also shows in some of the last projects that you showed, the one where where you're translating from the photograph to the 3D object, where in a way it's kind of an automated, or it looks like an automated process where you're seeing what comes up. So how do those two things play together? Because it seems that in one case you are you're actually looking for a very specific goal, which is to bring that let's say background condition into the foreground, and to make it conscious in the gallery to the visitor, whereas the other one, the project you showed at the end seems to be more about playing with uncertainty and with ambiguity, and with the idea that you can't tell really what came before, what came after, what's the result of what. So I guess there are two different things at play there, right?
I mean, there's something I talk about a lot when I've taught in some of my design studios. I ask the students to think about precise inexactitude, and also something that comes from my education and my work with Greg Lynn, where he famously talked about exact form and inexact, and then the third was anexact, which was sort of between these. So inexact would be just like not controllable. His argument was that that's not so useful for architects, because we have to be able to like know with some degree of certainty that we can repeat whatever that formal process is. There's some degree of control, but then the exact is like very defined, like in terms of the perfect sphere, something that's exact. And then in his own work with the embryological houses, he was looking at the territory between those, where things become dented and there are slight changes. So it's what he called anexact. But then what I became interested is thinking about this idea of precise inexactitude. So we think that, geometry is very precise, and so the drawing is supposed to show that we, digitally, if we can call that drawing, but we digitally create lines, splines, or whatever, and then those can be fed to a machine to say, okay, the machine is a tool path for a CNC mill or for a 3D printer. And so that's a fairly exact exchange. But the moment, what we loved, and it was almost like also kind of a provocation, and we thought very fascinating, to take this very ancient technique of glassblowing, which is, one would say maybe there is a different relationship to exactitude in terms of free blowing of the glass. In this case, it was very almost medieval in a way. We used CNC mills to precisely create these blanks, and then made plaster molds of the negative. And so the glass was blown into the mold, and then at exactly the right moment, you have to kind of open the mold, because the amount of pressure from the person blowing changes by each second. So like, depending on when you open the mold, you will have a slightly different instantiation. And in each of the lamps, you can see they're related. You see the lines, but none of them are really exactly identical. And so we thought that was of interest, to say, what happens if we embrace some material agency? To what extent can we deal with like a diversion in like control over the formal outcome? And so I think it's interesting that you point to that project in relation to the project with the kind of the rock and the image of the rock, the Semblances project, because there we were almost saying, like, without intervening, these images are just used as extrusions. And so you extrude from three sides, and then there's like a Boolean intersection, and whatever is not like in the intersection just gets erased. And what's left is that thing that looks like a rock, but it has nothing to do with a rock. It's a digital form. And so we thought that was kind of funny too. Like at what point the identity of this thing, and if we would do like via Selman's and paint it, you might even mistake it for a stone in the end. So it's kind of a commentary on like how we use these digital tools and processes, and to what degree they are, as to some extent, arbitrary. Like we think like, oh, it's highly precise, it's digitally controlled. There is a degree of the arbitrary there, I would say.
Yes, but there's also a degree of being deliberate in at least, I guess, or otherwise it would be maybe too big of a coincidence. But the fact that, for instance, as you were just saying, you have these three types of extrusions that sort of intersect, and that seems to be a very defining feature of the project, because depending on how you see it, you get a different impression, and suddenly you start to think that it's just one extrusion, but then you see it from a different angle and it's unclear, and at the same time you have these sort of pockets of space that are sort of alien to the whole system. So I guess there's also some, or a great deal of deliberate action, right, on that.
Because the idea was also that when you photograph, like if you would observe something in a landscape and then kind of sit down at the computer and say, I'm going to model that stone, only certain information would probably come along. You would probably just outline the mass and extrude and have the mass. In those objects, what's coming along, all those little pockmarks that you're mentioning, are part of the fact that the way the shadow was cast and light, like that becomes part of the object. And so we were fascinated that photogrammetry, when you use it to rebuild things, it brings not only the physical form, but it brings other qualities, shadows, reflection. And so if you try to do photogrammetry with like a reflective, clear glass, it doesn't work very well. It'll like leave out things because it doesn't understand the surface. And so those sort of extra qualities we were sort of fascinated to say, let's include those in the object. They become like almost burnt into the object in a way, part of it, or baked into it, maybe. They become part of it.
Let me ask you another question about that project now that we are talking about that. So can you say something about what led to the final definition of that object? Because again, it seems like there are some random effects or processes that give origin to those rock-like things. They are 3D printed, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there are a number of random operations, but I think there's also a great deal of thinking and discerning issues. So maybe it would be interesting to know, you just talked about the shadows and how they were incorporated and brought some kind of complexity into the what else would you maybe add to that in terms of possibilities, let's say, that appeared in the process and that you somehow critically managed or decided?
Yeah, I mean, the word managed is kind of interesting in terms of thinking how we work, because I think I have always been a little bit not so, I mean, I appreciate and admire the kind of virtuoso form making of some of my colleagues and my teachers, and the idea that there would be, you have a tool and you learn to use it perfectly and precisely, like learning to play an instrument, and you become a virtuoso, and that control of the tool is extremely important. And I do believe that, I agree with that one has to understand. So when we work with these things that seem to have an arbitrary quality, like the photogrammetry, it hasn't yet, hasn't resulted in a kind of final project. It's more of a research, but there are like 100 different sort of pieces of ground and trees and bushes, and there's a site where I've been going and returning and sort of scanning all of that material. And the learning process, each time you do that and you learn, okay, this is the outcome, you start to understand how that tool works and how you can use it to get certain qualities. So I think that that is kind of also part of the way of working, is to say that using a tool that would seem to be kind of at odds with like that formal virtuosity, it would seem to be almost counterintuitive, but it allows you to both look at the world in a different way and to make things you wouldn't have otherwise made. So the almost surveying of that site and then the management of that data. I mean, part of the plan then is to reconstruct this fictional landscape with the new objects that are produced by the photogrammetry. And so to look at like, what does that site become? And then in doing so, think about what its history is. What are the layers that are present? What kinds of vegetation, some indigenous, some non-indigenous, that really to connecting that to larger histories. But that's kind of an ongoing project that I'm currently working on.
Mm. I'm thinking about other slides and concepts that you discussed, actually I'd like to maybe I'd like to even go one by one, but that's not really possible. But let me maybe bring up two issues that are more general. And then maybe we can jump to questions from the participants, from the audience. But before that, if it's not too much, I guess one of the questions that your presentation brings up is do you allow this variety of tools, of techniques and concepts to coexist, let's say peacefully, in general, as a general rule, or do you become do you attempt to sometimes become more systematic in let's say eliminating incompatibilities or things that sound potentially colliding or difficult to reconcile? Because I guess what I'm asking is if you would accept this Borgesian image of the encyclopedia as your own motto of operation, or if you would say, well, maybe not so much, but perhaps let's scratch some out of those.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah, that's actually fascinating to think of that as like almost a mode of working. The Borgesian Encyclopedia. It's always been very dear to me. Like I love the writing of Borges, and the kind of weaving of facts and histories and certain forms of knowledge with things that become sort of fantastic, and you're no longer sure, like maybe this is actually true. I mean, just that amazing capacity, I think, is something that architecture also has, and the way we approach thinking about form making. And so in a way, that's why I enjoyed this provocation of the instant theory and the 24 images, and just because I looked at it not as like I've given many lectures on our work, and normally I would set up the whole thing in a different way and show more projects and not just like one image from the project and tell like exactly how we did it and what. But this was really an opportunity to kind of bring out all these things and place them. And so as I actually took it on as a real, I've been like working on it as a kind of fun way of re-seeing, what is important. And so that it's interesting you talk about that editing process, because for me, it was an opportunity to be like, okay, here are a few things that, why do I return to this? And I often tell my students that too, to keep a collection of, works by other architects, works by artists, texts, many different forms of media. And, you might not know exactly, like, why is it important? And tonight, I guess I tried to like speak to that a little bit and position them. But I realized in doing so, I was aware also, like, some things are more difficult to speak about. And like, is it, am I stretching the association too far? Does this really fit? For me, it resonates, but why is it that I'm placing these two things next to each other? And how clear is that? So I think there are degrees of clarity, and then some of them are maybe looser fit, and maybe they go to the side a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to stretch it much longer because there's a question here that I'd like to read. But I think in the next episode, maybe it would be interesting. When Peter Eisenman asked Bob Somewhere, how do you teach green dots? That I don't know if you heard that anecdote. In other words, how do you turn that toolbox into a kind of more systematic set of knowledge that you can transfer and somehow, I guess. But I don't want. I guess I'm just saying that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think my answer to that would be, it's a way of seeing the world and a way of seeing one's position in that world. And so when we think we have, I guess I'm always an advocate of degrees of uncertainty, that when we think we're really certain about something and it's fixed and that's the way it is and that's the way I see it, I always appreciate when I'm able to see it in a different way, where it becomes slightly less familiar and I become a little bit unsettled. That's when I really feel like alive in the world. And I think that some of the best architecture that I've seen or had the opportunity to experience and go to and visit has had that effect on me, where it's suddenly, you enter a building and it's like, this is not just, I didn't just walk through any door. This is a very special door. And I mean, sometimes those things are very hard to describe why it is. But that's where I think that's what's so compelling to me about this idea of Sarah Ahmed, that these things come to life and they almost dance with life. So the way of working, it would be maybe to allow oneself to experience things in that way, or to look for those moments and try to sort of identify them and kind of keep them close as you work.
I see. Okay, that's I think it's very interesting, but I think we want to open it up a little bit for questions, and maybe another time we'll continue. There's a question I want to read here by Lorena Quintana. It says, I have a question for Marcelyn. Could you comment on the workflow between digital scripts and artisanal production in your work? The workflow seemed kind of clear in the first servo project, where the digital drawing is a sort of original and then becomes the physical object with its own opportunities depending on the material. Does the digital artisanal flow ever get inverted or feedback both ways?
That's a great question. The sort of the digital as the starting point and then the artisanal kind of coming in at the end, that was definitely how that first project worked. And then setting the objects sort of together with the drawing to kind of think about that. I guess the question that you're asking, Lorena, might be about how could maybe then those physical things, the artifacts that are produced, maybe could be recaptured digitally or in some way drawn again digitally. And so those new artifacts that came in through the artisanal process maybe make their way back into a digital realm. I think that's definitely possible. We haven't quite done that. It was, but definitely, I would love to consider that in a project. I know that some of my students have done that. They've speculated also on a larger scale, like if you could use some of these like machinic processes in terms of constructing buildings, how, if you would design a material system that was meant to change, like if you were working with kind of wax and cast concrete and then sort of steaming the wax, like lost wax process, something that might change over time and have degrees of like kind of custom and analog qualities combined with digital qualities.
I think some of the early projects that you used to do with Greg Lynn at the ETH had some of that, didn't why with the potato thing and all of these experiments, you know, where you were translating from one medium to another back and forth, had a little bit of that.
Yeah, and even the word artifacting is something that Greg Lynn talked about a lot in terms of the way the CNC mill, if you would use it in a kind of incorrect way, maybe, you would get these sort of what he called artifacts, these kind of stripes that result from how you use the tool. And so that to me was always kind of fascinating. And then I became really, really interested in material agency and the idea of materials that change over time. And things, casting really does that. I mean, in a lot of my studies at the Architectural Association, I was doing a lot of casting. Also, that is a big influence coming from the studio, Raoul Bunschoten, and that project that I was showing, The Skin of the Earth, that I also worked on.
Okay, I'm not sure, Manuel, how we're doing in terms of time. I have a long list of things that I'd like to bring up, but I don't know if we are how we are doing.
I mean, we could go on for some minutes more. Thanks, Marcelyn. It's been great. But maybe I can jump in, and I have a question, and then Julian, I think you could go on after that. I mean, I was absolutely compelled by the presentation and amazed about the amount of affinities with the work at the school, and I had a whole bunch of questions that I think they were, but now I see that they are the type of, or some type of questions that Julian was asking. So I thought of a question that has nothing to do with that. That is, you mentioned the destabilization. You didn't mention disorder, but the idea of disordering or making uncertain is very present. And yeah, I was wondering if you're interested, and in which way, or in what degree of what comes after that. Like what comes after destabilization, because destabilization relies on a certain stability, and maybe there's a negation of that, or at least a disarticulation of that. If you're interested in the construction of new stabilities, maybe with the capacity to gather heterogeneity and not normalize it to a pre-established stability and so on. But yeah, I was wondering, what is your interest?
I mean, that's where I think I found the Foucault very inspiring, because the suggestion that these things will never, like if we compare translations between two languages, we kind of both know if we say the word and someone says like, oh, go get the chair or something, or get the book, and we reach for the book in two different languages, but there might be a moment where there's a nuance that the way we can never really know if we're understanding. And even if we learn to speak a language that we haven't operated in the world with originally, our relationship to it is going to be sort of different. So I guess, I mean, yeah, I wouldn't advocate at all for being in a constant state of destabilization. I think it would be, I often, when I see the Claude Parent, the oblique function, I think it's kind of a provocation, but I think, it could be a nightmare to live if everything was oblique and you could never settle. It's really difficult. But I guess the idea of sort of tenuous things that, maybe it's about convening with other people and agreeing like, okay, this creates some kind of stability. That I think is so important, that it's not an individual act, but it's kind of a collective act. But yeah, it's a big question because it relates also, beyond architecture to social stability or instability. But I guess the idea that maybe if one assumes that things are always fixed and that there are these kind of norms, it can lead to sort of excluding certain possibilities or certain people. But yeah, that's a really good question. I would say you kind of need both. You need moments of stability, but always to be aware of, thinking about that. Things could be unstable or destabilized, and why that might be good or necessary at some points. What do you think? Julian, maybe, or
no, I wanted to ask something else, but I mean, I guess I would like, if it would be possible, I don't know if we can have one more question, would be to discuss this issue of stabilization versus destabilization, and how the work contributes to one or the other, or both in different ways, let's say, in the context of what we were chit-chatting about before the beginning of the lecture, which is the changes that have been taking place everywhere, but I guess specifically in the US over the last year or 2 years or maybe a few years, and just to know if what I was suggesting that is being registered somehow in the work is actually the case, or how do you see that? Let's say, how do you see the impact of I guess it's a real destabilization of a number of issues that have been very ingrained in the culture for a long time, and how do you see the work in that context?
It's an interesting question, because the last images I was showing are from the sort of research project that I've been doing during this time of since March 2020. That the other projects precede that, and so it's interesting that during this time of many people talked about a time of uncertainty, and then others would say, well, certain things are certain because we know for sure that we're locked down and we're in a remote situation, and we know these things. But it's interesting that at that moment is the moment I sort of went to look at ground and consider ground, and to go outside. I mean, this became like partially, I think, a practice related to that, this idea of almost every day going. I mean, there's a place where I go and take hikes and walk, and I started to document these pieces of vegetation and the ground, and really looking at it also as a way of how does one approach the world? Like suddenly, I think for many of us, the March 2020 was a moment where like time seemed to stop, and everything we thought was kind of normal in a way, and the things we took for granted every day doing things suddenly were transformed, and painfully so, very painfully. And I think now is a moment also of, introspection and thinking, how do we, is there ever like a going back to what was before? Or, so yeah, I mean, it's not something, I guess, that I thought about explicitly with the work, but it would be interesting to consider why that choice.
But let me ask you the question in a more direct way. Let's say you were saying that you were telling us before that, and many people are aware of this, that for example, the whole set of issues regarding racial inequality in the U.S. became very hotly debated in the context of academia and everywhere, I guess, during the last couple of years, maybe last year specifically, and you also mentioned that. That there was that the school was very actively debating, and perhaps the question then would be, were there discussions that in which, let's say, specific agendas were brought into question or affected in some way, but by the political climate, was there any friction there that you can see, or perhaps?
I think it was a big moment, especially because I teach both in the design studios and the history theory faculties. So the question of like what our precedents are and what, when we talk about the architectural canon, just realizing how Western and, Eurocentric American and the role of, the white male and the idea that people of color, women, transgender, that there are many voices that have not been documented or included, or many people that did not have access to be included. And I think that is also the choice of beginning to look at authors like Sarah Ahmed, and her book really re-examines that history of phenomenology and says, not to discard anything. I mean, I think that there is maybe some polarized debate on, there are those that say, okay, throw it all out and make something different. And I think I would sort of agree with Sarah Ahmed's position, is that these things are not, it's not like this has no value, but it's like, let's see it for what it is and for what it isn't, and let's move on. And let's, there are new things to be written, new voices to come in. So that's something I think that a lot of my colleagues and I are actively working on, is how to do that scholarship. Like there's a lot of time that's needed to kind of bring those histories, bring those voices, bring the discussion into a much wider community. But again, in terms of the design practice, like the way that design has been taught, I know in my own education, I started in a very conventional, very prescriptive kind of pedagogy, where we would do site analysis and then we would propose, amassing on the site. There were certain rules. And I think teaching in a place like SciArc, it really we try to kind of shake that up a bit and say, what are the other ways of thinking about those pedagogies? And so I'm the coordinator of the Design Theory and Pedagogy program, which is a postgraduate program at the school. And my students are really producing models for different ways of teaching. Like how can we, all these things come maybe from the École des Beaux-Arts many years ago. And why is it that we still have the words like jury and charrette and all of these things we've inherited? And the way in which we conduct discussion about architectural pedagogy. That's something we're examining a lot.
Thank you, Marcelyn. Thank you very much. It's been a very generous lecture and conversation. I think we probably are running out of time. It's pretty late here. So I don't know, Manuel, if you what do you think? But I think it's maybe a
Yes.
good
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks again. Yeah. Thanks again, Marcelyn. It's been great, and I'm sure we'll be having you soon. I hope so. And yeah, thanks, Julian, for the introduction and response. Okay. Well, yeah, we'll be seeing next time in the next activity from the School of Architecture at Ditela. Thanks, Marcelyn.
Thank you.
Again.
Thank you, Manuel. Thank you, Julian.
Thank you, Marcelyn. Hope to pick it up again soon.
I hope so. I hope I can visit your school. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Bye, Marcelyn.
Bye.